Welcome to In Reality, the podcast about truth, disinformation, and the media. I'm your host, Eric Schurenberg, longtime journalist and media executive, now the founder of the Alliance for Trust in Media. If you've listened to this podcast more than once, you've likely heard a recurring question. What would it take to get Americans over their political alienation? Would it help to clean up and diversify our media feeds? Would it help to understand where the other side is coming from? Today's guest thinks the answer might be to emphasize all we have in common as Americans, as neighbors, as friends. More important than the theory, perhaps, is that he actually tested this hypothesis in the field. Matthew Lewandusky is a professor at the University of Pennsylvania and the author of Our Common Bonds. Through a series of experiments described in the book, he tested whether reminding us of what we have in common, friendships, sports teams, patriotism, can reduce the instinct to demonize fellow citizens. Some approaches work well, others hardly at all. His findings are especially interesting to me because they're closely related to an Alliance for Trust project in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, exploring whether shared local history can help bridge political divides. So today, as we brace for the 250th anniversary of our nation's founding, let's dive into the power of our common bonds. So here's Matt Levendusky. Matt Lewandusky, welcome to In Reality.
Thanks for having me.
It is great to have you here. One of the things about your career that is significant is that you've done an awful lot of deep study about political polarization. You and your research helped solidify an observation that has now basically received wisdom, namely that liberal and conservative Americans sort themselves into Democratic and Republican camps in a way that really didn't happen before in history. So I'd like to start just by asking how worried we ought to be about this trend. You could say if you look for polarization in American history, you can easily find it, and not just over slavery. The Vietnam War, civil rights, various Red Scares in the 20s and 50s. You could conclude that polarization is just the norm in a diverse democracy, or is this version more destructive?
So polarization is in some ways and should be understood as a kind of constant throughout most of American history. Indeed, there's really only two periods in American history where we don't have it, right? One is the very strange era of good feelings early in our politics, which really isn't replicable. That was a very different set of political arrangements, a different economy, very different country. And then the kind of post-war, let's call it like the late 40s through, roughly the early 60s, when there was this other sort of stable, low polarization era, right? But that second era of low polarization is really driven by the fact that the parties collude to keep the polarizing issues off the table, right? The most obvious one being the question of civil rights for Black Americans, right? So both Democrats and Republicans work to not address those issues, right? So we shouldn't understand that as sort of there was, kind of a pro-civil rights and an anti-civil rights party. No, both parties contained both of those factions, right? And, an important part of the story is that the parties then begin to sort themselves out with those changes. You can see that starting with the Civil Rights Act of 1957, then obviously getting stronger throughout the 1960s, right? And then, continuing on to the path that we know today. And in thinking about whether or not this is more or less dangerous, I'm less worried about what ordinary people do and more worried about what political elites do, right? So that, I think when I look at polarization in the public, right, there's a dance, right, where that both is a cause and an effect of what happens at the elite level. And so when I say elites, I mean, kind of elected politicians, party leaders, interest groups, like those sorts of things. I'm much more worried about that level, right, in the sense of kind of division and polarization there, because ultimately that's the much more damaging one, right? In part, and we can get into this later. Ordinary people, like, yes, they are more divided now than they used to be. Yes, partisanship is more strongly associated with ideology, and that has important consequences. But people also exaggerate the extent of polarization in the mass public. It's a phenomenon known as false polarization or perceived polarization. Right? And there's a number of studies that show that if you correct that, right, then people actually sort of like those from the other side more than they might otherwise do.
Well, let's dig deeper on that, because that is
Sure.
the focus of a lot of your book, your fascinating book, Our Common Bonds, which I guess centers around the hypothesis that a lot of this polarization is false polarization, that it's founded on misperceptions of what people on the other side of the political divide really believe and what they are really like. This happens to be a recurring theme on this show, In Reality, where braver angels and more in common, and politicians who are sort of divide bridgers like Rob Sand, running now at the moment we record for governor of Iowa, have all been guests. So let's talk about Our Common Bonds, where you experimented with a handful of ways to get people to look beyond political differences and recognize common interests, common bonds. Briefly, what were the bonds you sought to examine in those experiments, and how did you test them?
Sure. So I think just taking a step back, like the kind of overall premise of the book is similar to what I just said, that, we can think about not all polarization is false polarization or, perceived polarization. There are real important differences, and we should come back to that at the end. But part of that is, let's call it misperceived polarization, false polarization, use whatever term you like.
Mm-hmm.
And so we can say, like, well, where does that come from? Right. And so it comes from the fact that when we think about who's in the other side, right, we don't tend to think about ordinary people who are on the other side of the aisle from us, right? We tend to think about political activists. We think about the kinds of people we see talking about politics on social media, who tend to be among the most extreme, right? There's, good work from Pew and others, right? That, a huge share of political content online is produced by a very small segment of the public, and it's the segment of the public that happens to be the most extreme, right? And we think about, professional politicians, right? People we see talked about in the media. We think about activists, the people who attend rallies, right? These are typically the most politically engaged, the most politically extreme, the most politically divided people. So we tend to misestimate that, in part because if you and I just met in a normal conversation, right, you don't normally say to me, like, oh, are you a Democrat? Are you a Republican? Right? It's just not something that tends to come up, right? Now, it might come up more today than it used to because more things have come to be associated with partisanship, right? But those stereotypes aren't perfect, right? There's still a lot of, even if we get the kind of average right, there's still a lot of heterogeneity in those, types of stereotypes that we might have, right, about, Democrats and Republicans. So what I tried to do in Our Common Bonds was work through a couple of these, ways we might overcome this, right? Aren't certainly not the only ways, but just a couple of them. So one is thinking about sports fandom, perhaps as a bridging divide. One is thinking about friendships from the other party, and about 8 in 10 people do have those. And then the last one, which is the most effective, but also the kind of the most involved and most difficult to scale, is bringing people together for cross-partisan conversations.
How about questions about national identity? That's sort of we're all American.
Yes, sorry. Was the last one. Sorry, I forgot to bring that one up. Yeah, I mean, this one's really interesting because I think this is one where the effect is sort of changed. So the data in the book is largely from the Obama era. I'd initially published that work in 2018. So it's based on some data that Annenberg collected in 2008, looking at both the effect of the 4th of July and the 2008 Olympics as, kind of, we can think of them as kind of increases. If you want to use the language of social science, they're an exogenous shock. to national identity, right? Those are times when your kind of American identity gets primed. And the idea is that if you think about this American identity as opposed to being Democrats versus Republicans, right, it's a so-called superordinate identity. That is, it envelopes both Democrats and Republicans, right? So that's an identity that can kind of bridge between the two sides. And so when I'd done those earlier experiments, during the Obama administration, I found that worked quite well. Then I came back to it in the summer of 2020, and I found that it worked less well. And a few other folks have tried to replicate it since then, and they've found that it doesn't work nearly as well anymore. And I think part of the reason why is that if you think about why the national identity primes would work, right, or a patriotism prime, sort of going to be closely related, right, it's bringing together these sort of apolitical symbols, right? So if you look at why people are proud to be Americans, right, it's things like, oh, I'm really proud of the Constitution. I'm proud of the idea of America as a land of opportunity. I'm proud of one I wouldn't have predicted, but actually turns out to be something a lot of people are proud of, is like our national parks and American beauty, and lots of these sorts of things that aren't, if they're political, right, they're not, we don't think of them as like partisan, right? So if we think about the Constitution and having a history of stable democracy, right, that's not Democrat or Republican. But you can kind of think about, right, the sort of stuff that President Trump is doing around the July 4th, celebration. I always get the name of these two things wrong, right? One is America 250 and one is like America the Beautiful or something. I can't remember. Right, but there are these two kind of different competing groups, right? And he's sort of turning what's happening on July 4th at the White House into what, you could think of as sort of a Trump rally. Think about what he did in 2020 at Mount Rushmore, and then with, the military parades, right? And so it's not so much this sort of, hey, let's watch some fireworks and, celebrate what makes America great, right? It's bringing in these sorts of things that are going to problematize that, right? So it's not that July 4th is some sort of magic wand you get to wave over, these sorts of things. It's this idea of a kind of shared purpose and shared identity that's doing the bridging work. And to the extent that you don't have that, right, that's when those sort of bonds break down as a way of kind of bridging these divides.
Okay. Well, how about some of those softer bonds, softer identities, like support for the same sports team? Are those more effective? One thought I had about them as I read your book was that they seem kind of circumstantial. That after cheering for the Yankees from the bleachers at Yankee Stadium, then you go home to your liberal suburb or your conservative neighborhood, and polarization sets in again. Do those feelings disappear once the game is over?
I mean, they certainly dissipate, right? And this is one of the real challenges that we can think of this as a kind of like think of it as the bridging space or the polarization reduction space as faced, is that you can show that lots of these treatments work, right, in the moment, right? And the more you repeat them, the more they would work, right? But they're not, there's no way that you kind of just wish away all of these things. Like, no treatment is going to get rid of all of those things, right? Mm-hmm. So when I think about this, what I tell people is we're working on the margins. And I think the goal of all of these things, and when I talk to groups and I teach a class on this, what I tell the students is, I want to help you think about how to disagree better, right? Because disagreement is just part of living in a diverse liberal democracy, right? People aren't going to have the same ideas, right? And so part of the idea of politics and partisanship, there's some political science work that talks about this as a high partisanship, right? The idea is the goal of that is to sort of say, like, this is what we believe, this is what you believe. They're not the same thing, right? But we kind of understand the basis for those things, and we can compete, right, respectfully for the kind of way to move forward in society, right? So when I tell people about this, I don't think the goal of a lot of these things, as I've sort of continued to work through them, I'm less convinced the goal is like, oh, we're going to really reduce polarization. The goal is to help people better understand the other side's point of view and the reasons and rationales for their arguments.
Okay. All right, good. Well, let's double down on that, the sort of cross-party dialogue across disagreements. there are some organizations that do try to facilitate those kinds of conversations. Braver Angels, More Uncommon, Civity. Do you consider those efforts successful? And yeah, I guess I could also ask about the after effect that you've observed among your students who take a class on constructive conversations. Uh, are there ways to have these conversations that are not uncomfortable?
There's always going to be a little bit of discomfort. And this was actually, so I taught, it was actually my favorite class I've ever taught. This past fall, I taught, Penn has this new initiative around first year seminars. And so I'd done this as part of, I teach a senior seminar on polarization. And I thought, this would be fun to expand out into a first year seminar. And I did it, this fall, and it was just a great group of students. And, sometimes when I hear all these things about how bad college students are, I find it really healthy to be in the classroom and working with really smart and engaged students, because they give me a very different perspective than we hear a lot of that. So I had 15 students in the class, and we really engaged, closely each week with a set of readings and ideas. And we had a lot of discussions about, not just how you do this, but, we actually went and did it. And then, we taught some other first year students. That was their final project. We did an event for other first year students about how to do this. I think, worked well. But look, I think it depends on thinking about what your goal for those things is, right? I don't think the solution is to get everyone into a Braver Angels workshop or something. I mean, that'd be great if we could do it, but I don't think that's a very realistic goal. I think the way of thinking about this is I have to go to the gym if I want to stay in shape, right? I might not always like to do that, right? But it's something I have to do, right? If I want to be able to live a healthy life, right? In much the same way, you have to kind of practice these skills of, negotiation and difference and dialogue. And so I think it's about helping people learn how to do those things and have conversations in their everyday life, right? Because we're just never going to agree with everyone in our lives, right? America's too big, too pluralistic, too diverse of a country for that to be the case, right? And it would be frankly really boring if we all agreed on the same things. I mean, I think part of what makes it interesting is that we are this big, diverse multiracial democracy. So I think the success of those things is less are a lot of people doing it, and more if you go and do those things, do you feel more comfortable having those sorts of conversations in your life, knowing that they are going to be a little bit difficult and awkward, right? But feeling like maybe that you can sit with that difference and discomfort a little bit, and use it to kind of move that forward.
Yeah. Well, that's such a worthy and constructive way of thinking about it. Are there tactics that you can briefly describe for having those kind of conversations? The sort of classic Thanksgiving table argument with your crazy uncle. How do you have those conversations with people whose beliefs may be kind of intolerable or at least mysterious to you?
Yeah, so I always like to begin with the caveat that, it's totally fine to just not have them at an event like Thanksgiving, right? It's totally fine to say, you know what, we're just not going to talk about politics and we're going to enjoy each other's, company, right? And that's a totally, fine way to proceed. There's no, you're not a bad person if you, do that, right? But if you're going to go down that road, I think one thing that we worked a lot on in the class, I think is important, is just sort of establishing some ground rules about, what this looks like and how we're going to engage. And so I like to think about three things that I give to people, right? Or that when we did in the class, we kind of worked on a couple of things. So one that I would think about is thinking carefully about what civility means. So a lot of people mistake civility as a synonym for politesse. It's not, right? Civility is actually something much deeper. It means that we treat each other as if we have legitimate bases for our political opinions, right? And so that means I come in with an open mind and about you, and I'm going to listen and think critically and ask careful questions about your beliefs, and I'm going to expect you to do the same, right? And so I think that actually sets up a nice set of boundaries for when these conversations work and when they don't, right? And so I think, when you find that people aren't respecting the other side's, point of view and beliefs, I think that's a good time to sort of say, you know what, maybe this isn't such a productive conversation. Let's, switch gears and do something else. Second, and this is very hard for an academic because you can hear in these answers, I like to talk, right? You can't become an academic if you don't like the sound of your own voice. You're literally paid to stand up and do that several times a week to a classroom of students. But, listening more than you speak is really important, right? So there's a great coalition group called Listen First that I think just really nicely encapsulates that idea. And the third thing, and then I promise I'll stop for a minute, is thinking about how to ask probing rather than, provocative questions. So what I mean by the difference is if I'm a Democrat and you're a Republican and we come into this conversation and I say to you, why won't you just admit that Trump lied about losing the 2020 election? He obviously lost. And why do you persist on continuing to, spread this misinformation that there was vote fraud, right? That's just going to get your kind of defensive mechanisms up, right? And it's not going to really yield anything productive, right? Because all of a sudden I've kind of triggered your defensive rationale around your partisan identity. Instead, if I say, start with something like, what's something that your party did that really disappointed you, right? Where you sort of, wish they had done it, differently, right? Then it's kind of opening up a different sort of space for conversation, right? So those are, I think, some different, maybe ways of approaching this. But again, totally fine if you decide, you know what, this just is something where, and especially there are going to be some topics, right, that maybe you just feel like, you know what, I'm just not ready to kind of have a conversation about this, right? It's too personal, it's too raw, that maybe you kind of set those off the table.
Okay, great. Those are three kind of easy to remember touch points. That you start with the assumption that your counterparty has a reasonable basis for the belief. You listen more than you talk, and that you ask questions that are not provocative, but rather probing and open-ended. So that's a kind of handbook or rule book or playbook for us ordinary citizens dealing with polarization. But you mentioned at the top of our conversation that what really worries you is the polarization among elites, or at least their tendency to promote polarization because it serves their particular narrow interests. What are the mechanisms for changing incentives among elites? And you mentioned political activists or the politically engaged social media influencers. You might also throw in some institutional media as well. How do you change their incentives so that it changes the temperature, of the national debate?
So I was laughing there just because this is the question everyone asks, and there isn't really a good answer, right? I mean, I think part of it is we're in a very unstable political equilibrium right now, right? So if you go all the way back, you have to go all the way back to 1990, before 1992, before either party really had a kind of stable governing majority, right? Things have really swung back and forth, right? For my adult life, basically. Well, I guess I was in middle school in 1992, so it's not really for most of my life, let's say. Right, but that's not the norm in American politics, right? The norm was that these periods were pretty brief, right? And then there was this kind of longer, stable governing coalition, right? In fact, in order to get to one where there was this sort of long period of kind of flipping back and forth, right? You have to go back to the late 19th century, right? Between the compromise the Rhine Compromise of 1876, right, and then kind of 1896, kind of roughly, right? And now we're actually we're even a little bit longer than that, right? And so I think it's just we're in this moment where everything's very unsettled, right? Things are on a knife edge, right? I think that's why we're seeing these things like, oh, let's redistrict to get these couple of additional seats from Texas, and oh, let's try to see if we can do it in Virginia or in California, right? Because these very tiny little swings are going to push us one way or the other. And so I think in that world, it's just going to be very, very hard because these very small shifts on the margin are going to have big consequences for policy, right? So, imagine that, 44,000 voters had switched, right? And, Hillary Clinton had become the, president in 2016. then you have a very different Supreme Court, right? You probably get a different Senate as a result, right? The equilibrium path just veers in this very different direction. So I think neither party, right, really has much of an incentive in this current moment to think about how to maybe behave better and more constructively, right? Because they're very focused on like, no, we have to take back power so we can, advance our agenda and block the other party's agenda. But I think the way you see this is that if you look at both Trump's strategy in 2024 and Kamala Harris's strategy in 2024, it was basically to win like 51% of the vote, right? That they both were kind of like, no, I'm going to tip like just enough people into my camp so that I can win. That no one was thinking about like, how do I make this big appeal to like a broader swath of Americans, right? And so I think that's why you see so many Americans, like if you see there's just kind of poll after poll showing, how politically frustrated people are, they feel that politics isn't working, right? And I think it's because this is like we're just stuck in this bad equilibrium, and in a way, kind of until we get out of that, it's just really hard to know how to move forward.
Interesting. Given my background as a journalist, I'm kind of hyper aware of the role that media has played, professional journalism, and not just social media influencers, on the tenor of political discourse. So, focusing for a second on media, how can media be part of the solution and not an intensifier of the problem?
Yeah, I mean, so this is a great question. I think part of this is thinking about, what it is that we want to convey, right? And one of the challenges is that politics is a story that, if you go back and look at the old literature on like, well, what makes a story newsworthy, right? Conflict is front and center. And so politics is basically all about conflict. But I think there's some nice work that people like Francis Lee and others have done on kind of like media coverage of Congress, right? And what does it emphasize? It emphasizes like, well, there's this bill, and Republicans say this, and like Democrats say that, right? And the incentive is to think about framing that conflict, but we don't hear about a lot of the kind of behind the scenes cooperation that kind of that actually like works with a lot of these things. So I think, the other thing that I don't have a solution to, but one thing that has really changed dramatically in the media landscape is the disappearance of state and local coverage. And so that means that everything then moves up into this national frame, right? I'm all for, I think it's great, what organizations like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal have done, right? But they're going to cover this very narrow slice of politics, right? Largely kind of let's call it politics as spectacle of Washington, D.C., and it's going to miss a lot of these sorts of things that are members are doing, for their district on these smaller, kinds of things. And that really just there's no mechanism to convey that to people, right? The last kind of mechanism is sort of, press releases from members that they post on their website, right? But even as someone who probably is the 98th or 99th percentile of political interest, I have to admit that's not something I'm really going and digging into it.
Definitely. I'm with you on that. Just looking at the media question from the other side of the information transaction from the demand side, are there media consumption practices that readers of news can use to counter effect the polarizing tendencies of a conflict obsessed press?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways, there's the media shift has been this very much this two-edged sword, right? If you are interested in avoiding political news, it has never been easier, right? Because the world, in some ways, right? Every time I go to read a political story, my competition in some ways, if I go to like the New York Times, my competition is in other stories in the New York Times or other newspapers. It's, social media, it's YouTube, it's Netflix, it's, a WhatsApp message from a friend, right? It's all those sorts of things. So I think if you are interested in avoiding some of this conflict frame, right, you can kind of just seek out other coverage, right? So there are, places you can go that I think will do, more of that, right? So you can go and now, especially with things like Substack, right? There's a lot of great Substacks. One of my favorites is, Kevin Kosar's, which for anyone who's interested in Congress. He has tons of great information, lots of it that's really useful for teaching.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of other, political and social writers who write there, right? So I think now you can work to also then kind of curate different types of information flows, right? And the other thing, you can even do is try to get news from, different perspectives, right? So, I try to look both at kind of US and some overseas sources, right? Take a look at some more kind of, let's call that mainstream, probably center to center left sources, right? And then also some, sort of center right sort of sources to kind of look at and see, what kind of, because part of it isn't just they're covering the same things from a different lens, but also they're covering different stories as well. And it kind of shows you like, okay, maybe there's this broader set of things, some of which, right, I might not see if I'm not kind of doing a bit more of this kind of coverage selection.
I'd like to wrap up by pushing back on, in a mild way, with the notion that there's nothing that can be done to persuade the elites to behave in a more constructive and non-polarized way. You mentioned that things like primary reform or ranked choice voting or other things like that have not proved effective. But wouldn't you agree that in many ways the elites, politicians, media, influencers, are responding to the desires of their audience? And so, in a way, sort of a movement among all of us can affect things in a way that is perhaps more powerful than we believe. And just to support that notion, I'd like to read you the final statement in your book on Uncommon Bonds. It ends with this statement: if we, the people, accept that there are things we can do to build bridges and a common future, we can rise to the challenge. Working together, there is no doubt that ordinary citizens can do just that. Do you still believe that?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think, again, like, I think that ordinary people can move these things on the margin, right? That's certainly possible and very much a goal, kind of worth pursuing. The elite piece is harder, but I don't think harder should be taken to mean, impossible, right? Lots of things seem impossible until they happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I can think about ways you might do this. It's just the system is set up very much to reinforce all of these sorts of incentives, from everything about, campaign finance, right, to media coverage, to all of this, right? It's just, that's a very big and very hard challenge without a lot of obvious solutions.
All right. Well, let's leave on a hopeful note and the stirring final paragraph of your book. And Matt, thank you very much for joining us on In Reality. It was great talking to you.
Thanks so much for having me.
That's Matthew Lewandusky of the University of Pennsylvania. One of the things I appreciate about Matt's work is that it resists easy answers. He argues that America's polarization won't truly subside until politicians and media lose their incentives to drive division, and he acknowledges that's really hard. But remember that elites respond to their audiences. We can choose ourselves to strengthen the relationships that make civil disagreements possible. Matt's 3-point formula: assume good intentions, listen actively, and ask questions that seek to understand, not debate. And we don't have to wait for the elites to change first. In Reality is a production of the Alliance for Trust in Media. Our producer is Tom Platts of Sound Sapien. Research and production support come from my Alliance for Trust in Media colleague, Kiki Patrick. Thanks for listening. And if you enjoyed this episode, please share it, subscribe, and join us next time.